Welcome back to Dave's Desk as we're looking at another of our Bible Basics series, and today we're looking at the book of Samuel. I say the book of Samuel, but if you open a Bible it'll say 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Not a very exciting reason for this, but in 1 Samuel, or for Samuel, for Kings and for Chronicles, which we'll get to over the next few videos, when they're first translated into Greek, the Greeks didn't have long enough parchment scrolls to translate the whole book, so they cut it in half and had one first and second. But it's all one book as far as the Hebrews who wrote it, and therefore we'll deal with it as one book now. And the book of Samuel is really a book about who leads God's people. And it starts with the birth of Samuel. We see Samuel's mother Hannah come and she's praying to God. She's desperate for a child, and she devotes the hope of a child to God. And so when she finally conceives and gives birth to Samuel, she gives him over to God's service. And we have this great song of praise from Hannah at the beginning. And it talks about how God ministers through Samuel, how he anoints Samuel to be the final judge over the people, how he uses him and to defeat the enemies of God. But eventually the people of Israel reject Samuel as their leader. They reject God, and they say, we want to have a king like all the other nations around us. We want to have a king like them. We want to have this symbolic figure. We don't want to be a commonwealth of tribes anymore. We want a king, so they lead armies for us and show off. They didn't need it. Samuel had just demonstrated that, but that's what they wanted. And God sort of led Samuel to warn them that a king would oppress them, that a king would have taxes and feudal demands on them, but no, the people were all sold out for a king. And so God led Samuel to anoint Saul, and Saul was this guy who really looked like a king. And to begin with, he did the right stuff. He was anointed, he was blessed, and God used him powerfully. But the idea of being king really went to Saul's head. He thought he was the absolute ruler of the people of Israel. He wouldn't listen to the law of God. He wouldn't listen to Samuel, who spoke for God as God's emissary. And so he placed himself above God and stopped following God's call on his life. And so he stopped being anointed by God as king. Samuel was led to someone else called David, who really didn't look like a king, but God said, no, this is a man after my own heart. And so he was anointed king, but he refused to attack Saul because Saul was the king and God had put him there. And so only when Saul died in battle does David become king, and he rules for about 40 years. And his rule is far from perfect. He makes some fairly massive mistakes, does some fairly selfish, horrendous things. But the difference between Saul and David ultimately is that David recognises that he's making mistakes, and he humbles himself before God and he repents of his sins, because he understands that although he's wearing a crown and sitting on a throne, God is the leader of God's people, not a king. And for me, the story of Samuel, which is obviously long, that's why they chopped it in half, is one that focuses on who do we allow to rule over us? Do we try and make ourselves the ruler, or do we allow God to be the ruler? Do we listen to the words of God, or do we listen to the words of somewhere else? I hope that's given you something to think about. Hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.